Northern Telecom, or Nortel, was once the star of Canada's high-tech industry. For more than 100 years, a crown jewel in a small but vibrant sector. With its new inventions, technological breakthroughs, it kept Canada on the world stage. All of that, though, came to an end this year when Nortel filed for bankruptcy. Recently, in a controversial move, it sold off some key chunks of its businesses to foreign companies. Carmi Levy is industry analyst. He joins us from our station in London, Ontario. Mr. Levy, what does this collapse of Nortel represent, do you think, for Canada's high-tech sector at large?
It represents a pretty slippery slope as far as the sector is concerned, because if this continues, if this trend continues, obviously not with large companies like Nortel, but with other firms, at some point we won't have Canadian-owned firms based here in the country making decisions that affect Canadian workers. And so essentially legacies of decades of technology development, the decisions will no longer be made here. They'll be made elsewhere, which will be a loss for Canada and for Canadians.
I know that you watch this industry very closely. Is this case of Nortel, is it isolated, or do you see this as a trend happening in Canada?
Unfortunately, Canada has a history of not holding on to its top technology properties. We can look no further than the Avro Arrow, almost 50 years ago, that essentially was the pinnacle of aerospace technology and was allowed to be frittered away. And as a result, Canada's aerospace industry, which was world-leading at the time, essentially spent the next generation and a half in the backwoods. And so we don't want to repeat that with our high-tech industry today.
Can a country like Canada, I'm thinking about the Nortel example before that Newbridge, can Canada have its own independent and viable high-tech sector? Is that realistic to think we can do that?
It absolutely is. Canada has a legacy of developing world-leading telecommunications technology by virtue of our geography, our education system, and just the fact that we prioritize this. We are a world leader in this. But what we need to do is get better at protecting those assets once they've taken root. So, for example, look no further than Research in Motion. The last thing we would want to do is for that company to ever fly the coop. Canadian government and industry needs to look at ways to create more Research in Motion examples, as well as Nortels, and not let them be bought out by foreign companies.
So explore that point a little bit, because there was a lot of talk when this deal with Nortel was being discussed about selling off some of its assets, of the Canadian government getting involved. This was a question of national security, national importance, and the government declined to do that, let the sale go through. Should they have stepped in, do you think?
Well, I think from purely Canadian technological landscape, they should have, but Stephen Harper had another agenda. He didn't want to seem overly protectionist, and he said, if you want to play the free trade game, the last thing you can do is step in here. Is that good for Canadian business? Probably not. Is it good for Canada's position on the global trade perspective? Yeah, absolutely yes. And so there are a number of competing initiatives here, a number of competing perspectives. Unfortunately, Canada's technology landscape or our market didn't benefit from the government's perspective here.
So when we're talking about the next step for Canada's high-tech industry, we talked about Research in Motion, what's left of it after the end of Nortel. What are some concrete things do you think that government should be doing, the business sector should be doing, in order to ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen with other would-be Nortels out there?
The key word here is partnership. Government needs to work with industry as well as our educational infrastructure to build partnerships that are deeply rooted. So what you do is you work closely with universities to develop the skills that create next generation businesses, and then those businesses have incentive to stay here because that supporting infrastructure is here, and that if a foreign company wants to come in and buy them out, it will do so at its peril, because that strength of operations and that strength of future business simply won't be there if they rip the guts out and move them across the border. And so you need to have that partnership in place first as a disincentive for foreign ownership.
All right, Carmi Levy is an industry analyst joining us from London, Ontario. I appreciate you talking to us today, Mr. Levy.
Thanks for having me.